The building that breathed. When the Wilkerson family first laid eyes on the apartment building at the corner of 8th and Sycamore, it was everything they had hoped for. Towering over the neighborhood, the Victorian-era structure was a grand monument to a forgotten time. Dark brick, large windows, and ornate ironwork spiraled up to the roof. The rent was unusually low for a building that size, but that only made it more appealing. "Think of the stories we'll have," Dan Wilkerson told his wife, Marie, as they signed the lease. "This place is a piece of history." It wasn't long before their two children, Ella and Jake, started to complain. From the very first night, both claimed they could hear whispers coming from the walls, like voices trapped just behind the plaster. The parents brushed it off as childhood imagination, the product of a new home and overactive minds. But as days passed, even Dan and Marie began to feel uneasy. The building felt alive. They noticed subtle shifts, doors that would open or close on their own, the temperature dropping unexpectedly, or the strange, almost organic groaning that echoed through the halls late at night. It was as if the walls were breathing. Ella, the youngest at 8, was the first to start changing. She became unusually quiet, spending hours staring out of her bedroom window at the courtyard below. One night, Marie found her standing motionless in the kitchen, her eyes glazed over. "Sweetie, are you all right?" Marie asked, her voice trembling. Ella slowly turned her head, her eyes eerily wide. "They're coming soon." Marie's heart skipped a beat. "Who's coming?" "The people in the walls," Ella whispered, then walked away as if nothing had happened. Marie tried to shake it off, but that night she dreamt of dark figures moving through the walls, whispering, plotting. She awoke in a cold sweat, feeling as though someone was watching her. Dan, a skeptic by nature, began experiencing things he couldn't explain. Tools he left in one room would appear in another. His phone, always on the kitchen counter, would vanish, only to be found days later in a part of the building he hadn't visited. One evening, while working late in the basement, he swore he saw a shadow dart across the room. He tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light, but his hands were shaking too badly to continue. Jake, the oldest at 14, was next. One night, as he was brushing his teeth, he heard a faint scratching noise. It was coming from behind the bathroom mirror. As he leaned in to listen, the scratching stopped, and then he heard a voice, his own voice, whispering his name from within the wall. "Jake!" He recoiled in horror, dropping his toothbrush. The voice stopped as suddenly as it had started, but the terror lingered. From then on, Jake refused to enter the bathroom alone. A week later, the family discovered an old diary hidden in the attic, belonging to a woman named Margaret Avery, who had lived in the building in the early 1900s. The entries were disturbing. Margaret had written about strange happenings in the building, objects moving on their own, voices in the walls, and neighbors disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The last entry was especially chilling. June 12, 1913. Asterisk, "They've come for me. I can hear them in the walls. They say they need a body. The building needs to feed. If you find this, you're next, asterisk." Marie wanted to leave, but Dan insisted they stay. "It's just an old woman's delusions," he argued, though his voice lacked conviction. He was starting to doubt himself, too. Then, one night, everything changed. It started with Ella. She began sleepwalking, roaming the halls in the middle of the night with her hands outstretched, as if searching for something, or someone. Marie would gently guide her back to bed, but each time Ella would mutter in her sleep about the others and the dark place below. Then Jake began hearing his name again. Not just from behind the mirror, but from every wall in the building. The voices grew louder each night until they were screaming his name in unison. He started covering his ears and shouting at them to stop, but nothing helped. His face grew pale, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Marie decided to confront the landlord, Mr. Reynolds, an elderly man who had managed the building for decades. When she asked him about the strange occurrences, his expression grew grave. "That building." He hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's old. Older than it should be. There are things in the walls, Mrs. Wilkerson. Things that should never have been disturbed. What do you mean? Marie demanded, her voice rising in desperation. He sighed deeply, lowering his voice. It was built over something ancient. Something buried deep below. The previous owners tried to seal it off, but the building, it feeds on the living. It needs bodies to sustain itself. Marie felt a chill run down her spine. Why didn't you tell us this before we moved in? I didn't think it would happen again, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's been decades since the last incident. I thought it was over. But it wasn't over. That night, the building came alive. The Wilkersons were awakened by the sound of groaning and creaking, louder than ever before. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly, rhythmic beat, like the heart of some great beast. The floorboards buckled and twisted as if something beneath them was trying to break through. Jake screamed from his room. Dan and Marie rushed in to find their son standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide with terror. The walls around him were moving, bulging inward as if they were being pushed from the other side. They're here! Jake shouted, pointing at the walls. They're coming! Suddenly, the room went silent. The walls stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the floor beneath Jake's feet gave way, and he was swallowed into the darkness below. Marie screamed as Dan frantically tried to pull their son back, but it was too late. The hole in the floor sealed itself, leaving nothing but smooth, undisturbed wood. Jake was gone. Panicked, Dan and Marie grabbed Ella and fled the apartment. They ran down the stairs, the building groaning and shaking around them. But as they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped. Suddenly, Ella's body went rigid. She turned to face her parents, her eyes black as coal, her voice not her own. The building needs to feed, she said in a voice that echoed with 100 others. You can't leave. Not until it's finished. Dan lunged for the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Marie screamed, clutching Ella, but her daughter was unresponsive, staring straight ahead with that unnerving, empty gaze. Then, with a sickening crack, the walls began to split open, revealing the rotting, skeletal remains of previous tenants. Decayed hands reached out from the gaps, clawing at the air, desperate for release. The building itself seemed to shudder with anticipation. Desperate, Dan grabbed a nearby fire axe and began hacking at the door. Each swing sent splinters flying, but the door held fast. Behind him, Marie screamed as the skeletal hands reached for her and Ella, pulling them toward the widening cracks in the walls. Just as all hope seemed lost, the door burst open. Dan grabbed Marie and Ella and dragged them outside. They stumbled into the street, gasping for breath as the building behind them fell silent once more. They never went back. Weeks later, the Wilkerson family moved far away, hoping to escape the nightmare that had nearly claimed them. But even as they settled into their new home, the trauma lingered. Then one night, as Marie was tucking Ella into bed, her daughter looked up at her with those same black eyes and whispered, "It's not over." And from the walls, the whispers began again. The end. Or is it? ****.
Don't forget to subscribe.